Everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Philosophy 307, Philosophy of Law. I'm your professor, Professor Jimmy, or you can call me Jimmy, either one's fine. And this week we're going to talk about the institution of property as it relates to things like freedom, prosperity, and solving problems that governments are designed to solve. And we're going to see how this relates to our section on Native Americans and property next week. And um, I guess it's an institution of property. Um, Before we get into property and why it's important for the law and governments and states, we should focus on a problem. The problem is known as the tragedy of the commons, and it's a problem going back to the 60s. It was identified in an article. We're not going to read it for this class, but if you take an environmental ethics class with me, we would read it. It's called The Tragedy of the Commons by a guy named Garrett Hardin, 1969. And in it, Hardin lays out what he thinks is a tragedy that occurs under certain conditions. Um, so if you're watching from the picture on the screen, you can see on the right hand we have a very lush, beautiful pasture with trees and a waterway. We have lots of cows grazing, bushes, and presumably lots of other organisms, wildlife, etc. And on the left side, you see a desolate wasteland, something that you might see in a backdrop of The Walking Dead, for example, and the land has just been decimated. Presumably, this could be a bomb, natural disaster, overuse. But the stark contrast in the picture is meant to illustrate what we mean by the tragedy of the commons. So, a commons is any place where resources are shared by a common group of people. Uh, this could be strangers, it could be people within the same ethnic group, it could be family members, it could be people within the same city, it could be people within the same nation. But it's a common group of people, and the individuals and tribes within that group have little incentive to preserve the shared resources. So if you can imagine, like this is a common problem, you can imagine any number of resources that are shared by a common group, but where everyone is basically trying to get the most for themselves. A tragedy of the commons could even occur among roommates, actually. So you might think of a shared resource, for example, as a living room, and the individuals, being the roommates and the sharing the apartment, have very little incentive to try and preserve a roommate space. In fact, probably try and get as much as they can. Maybe not every roommate that one has, but I've had roommates like this, and I'm sure you have too, if you've had roommates or dorm mates or what have you. But a tragedy of the commons basically occurs under these two conditions, A and B. So, provided the resources are shared by a common group, and provided the individuals and subgroups within that group have very little incentive to share and preserve the resources, then a tragedy of the commons ensues. And tragedies of the commons are everywhere, whether it is waterways, grazing, etc. So the A and B components that I've given you to the tragedy of the commons sound a little abstract, and indeed they are. But once you get a few examples of it, you'll start to see them everywhere. This is something that my wife will regularly comment on. She'll be like, "Yeah, I know, it's a tragedy of the commons." They really are everywhere. And one of the things that governments do well, one of the few things that, and arguably they do better than almost anything else, is solving tragedies of the commons, instituting systems to preserve resources. But in any case, so what are some examples of the tragedy of the commons? Well, overfishing the oceans is the classic example. It's the oceans are commons, meaning that they have resources and they're shared by a group of people, largest group of people that could be, at least on planet Earth, meaning everybody. Anybody with a boat and a fishing line can technically go out to international waters and do all the fishing they want. And the individuals in the group being humanity, have little incentive to preserve the shared resources. So if you're out there fishing the oceans, whether you're with a company or a private fisherman or fisher person or whatever, you have your own boat. Maybe you're just trying to provide for your village, or maybe you're working for a huge corporation um, that uses thousands and millions of pounds of fish a year. But in any case, you have very little incentive, whether you're an individual or a corporation, to preserve the fish in the oceans. You want to get as much fish as you can, especially insofar as you can sell it or eat it. Overgrazing fields is another one. This is a common problem, especially in places like Arizona, Colorado, California. I'm originally from California. I lived on the East Coast in DC for about a decade for school, and then came back to the somewhat West Coast, ended up in Arizona. But I can tell you that the overgrazing fields issue isn't nearly as sanguine or important in the East Coast as it is. It seems to be much more of an issue in the West, and I suspect that's just because we have more grazing here. Same thing with air and water pollution. Unpolluted water and air is a shared resource. You walk down the street and someone's smoking a cigarette, for example, a car backfires, planes overhead. These are all instances of individuals who are exploiting, sorry, a resource shared by common people, in this case, clean water, clean air. And the individuals in that group have very little incentive to preserve those shared resources. And really, when I say the individuals in the group have little incentive to share resources or preserve resources, what I mean by that is for other people. Meaning I may have as an individual an incentive to preserve resources for my family or my church community, my school, maybe my friendship circle. Maybe I'm part of a gang or a mob. Maybe I'm part of a tribe. Maybe I'm part of, you can imagine any number of kinds of groups, is my point, where you may have an incentive to preserve the resources for that group because you care about the group, you're part of the group, and it's important to you. But you don't really have an incentive to share, to preserve shared resources for strangers within the group or people that you may have a problem with. Why should I share? Why should I save, preserve resources for the person whose job I'm trying to steal at my work? Right? I want that promotion, and Bob is in my way. So why would I preserve resources for Bob? Screw Bob. But you can see this occur. This reoccurs. So what really condition B is not preserving resources. Not people lack incentives to preserve resources per se, but they often do when it comes to people they don't care about or people outside their subgroup or something. Um, Same thing with climate change. Climate change is probably the tragedy of the commons, like the mother lode, so to speak. It's probably the biggest issue in terms of I can't. I mean, you can imagine space trash might be another one that's huge, like satellites in space and that sort of thing. Is space travel, the orbital circle around the Earth where satellites travel, like that's another potential tragedy of the commons. Overusing groundwater. This is a huge issue in Arizona and something that the state of Arizona has to make laws to prevent because, large parts of Arizona, at least the populated parts, except for, Flagstaff and a few places north, live in deserts, and deserts are defined in part by their lack of rain. So you rely on groundwater. And overusing groundwater, insofar as it's a common resource and people don't really have an incentive to preserve it for others, is a tragedy of the commons waiting to happen. It's not quite a tragedy yet, meaning we haven't gotten rid of our groundwater entirely or overused it entirely. But that's only because the state stepped in and taken steps to preserve the groundwater. Um, Natural gas and oil reserves are another one. These are huge commons, meaning there's lots and lots of natural gas and oil. And the more technologically advanced we become, the more we are able to access natural gas and oil that's trapped. But eventually it's going to run out. And unless you own the oil rights, like if you're getting it from a common area, a tragedy will eventually ensue. Same thing with traffic congestion. Access to uncongested highways, freeways, and other ways. I don't know if you've been on the freeway lately, but it's depending on the day, part of the or time of the day, depending on the day, it can be a lot. You can sit in congestion for a long time, and it's a giant waste, and it's in a sense it's kind of tragic. Not to mention not very fun. Overuse of antibiotics. The ability to use antibiotics to fight a disease, in a sense, has a lot of the same features as our commons, and a tragedy is ensuing, and that antibiotics have become, in the last 20 years, less effective because we've overused them. So you can probably think of many, many examples of yourself, but these are tragedies of the commons. They happen everywhere. And it's something that you really need some sort of mechanism to solve. So the law is one way of solving this problem, or addressing the problem anyway, mitigating it. So what we need is really a system to incentivize people to preserve resources. And like I said before, when we're talking about component B, the individuals in that group have little incentive to preserve those shared resources, is really emphasis on the shared part. Um, the problem is that in a commons, so whether it's a park bench, whether it is a national park, whether it is someplace, whether it's air or water, like international waters. And the commons people can't prevent others from taking more than they need or want. And everyone has the incentive to take as much as they can get, provided they need it or want it or it's valuable to them. So the problem with commons is they're hard to police. You need to find a system where people are incentivized to preserve resources. So one of the mainstream ways we do, one of the main ways we do this, although you're going to find different solutions to tragedies of the commons depending on the culture. Native cultures do things a little differently. Eastern Asian cultures do things a little differently. But in any case, you don't necessarily need the government to solve the tragedy of the commons. But I suspect that's the reason a lot of governments have sprung up. There's not a landmass anywhere except Antarctica that doesn't have a government of some kind on it. So I suspect that's why. Um, so one solution is proposed by the philosopher David Schmitz, and it's something that we just sort of take for granted and don't really think much about, but it's the institution of property. Property by its very nature is something that you can own. Uh, it's something that allows you to keep others out. So, one of the things that makes property property, to say you own property as opposed to renting, is that you can discharge of it as you see fit, meaning you can get rid of it if you want, super cheap. You can give it away. You can prevent other people from using it. It's your land, it's your property. And just like owning anything else. So if you own a car, you own a house, you own clothing, owning something means that you can discharge it basically as you see fit, insofar as you're not adversely affecting other people's ownership, etc., and that you can prevent others from using it. Same thing goes with property. So one thing the institution of property does do, it is incentivizes owners to prevent resource shortages. And there's any number of reasons for that. Um, but one of them is um, that it allows for future use. So I may not want neighbors to overfish our shared lake because I want access to fish in the future. The problem, of course, is that if it's a shared lake and I can't keep them out or prevent them from overfishing the lake, and I can't incentivize them to preserve fish for the future, they may not have that incentive. Suppose someone's getting ready to sell the property, or they don't really care that much about the future, or they're sort of irrational where the future's concerned. Maybe they're sickly and about to die. Maybe they're passing on their property to their family as they're moving on. There's any number of reasons why people might not care about that shared lake, might not care that the fish are gone because it's been overfished. However, if you owned the lake and you wanted to preserve fish in that lake for your future use, you could prevent others from fishing. One of the defining features of a commons is that no one has the right to keep others from using it. Um, However, if someone owned the property, they would have an incentive to treat it better than if it's shared. Think about how often, when you have a rental car or you're in an Uber, are you concerned about the cleanliness or quality of the car? Not nearly as much as if you owned it, presumably. So, of course, you care insofar as you're using the rental car, or insofar as you're a passenger in an Uber or a Lyft or a Waymo, whatever it is. So you care about the quality of that car and the cleanliness of the car insofar as you're using it in that moment for that temporal slice. But you would care about it a lot more, presumably, all else being equal, if you owned the car. So ownership gives people an incentive to care about what they own. Sometimes it's pride of ownership. It's tied to your reputation. Look how well I keep my property. Sometimes it's just out of your sheer interests. It's in my interest to preserve the fish in the lake that I will need in the future. It's in my interest to keep the air clean to the best of my ability that I will be breathing. I want the water to be clean in the future that I will be drinking. Because I don't just exist in the present moment, I also exist in the future, provided I don't die or something. And until I die and until I pass away, I want the ability to access my property and my resources without them being in the future, without them being exploited by others. So ownership of property is an institution, meaning it's enforced by other people. It's the sort of thing that's backed up by the courts. It involves deeds and other legal documents that the state recognizes. And this is something that the founders recognized, that you really need property rights to deal with tragedies of the commons. Tragedies of the commons are everywhere, and you can't have a nation govern things if you're constantly dealing with tragedies. Water is out, pollution's everywhere. Now, people may resort, maybe will respond here and say things like, well, we have these problems. We have pollution. We have overuse of resources. To which I say, yeah, that's true. We do. The government's not perfect and it can't do everything. But what's the counterfactual look like? What does the world look like without the government doing these things and without some sort of an institution whose job it is to prevent tragedies of the commons? So the solution was anticipated by our founders in the Constitution. The Constitution protects property rights of the Fifth and 14th Amendments, due process clauses, and Fifth Amendment's taking clauses. So this is something the founders thought a lot about. Nor shall private, to quote the takings clause, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Now you might imagine, well, if there's private property and it's taken for public use, why does it need just compensation? Well, to solve the tragedy of the commons, if you allow the government to seize land however it sees fit for public use without having to compensate the owner, it's just going to do that whenever it feels like it. So insofar as you want to make sure people's rights are protected, you want to make sure that they're compensated when their rights are violated. Imagine your rights being violated at work. You go to your job and you're harassed. You're treated like shit. You're physically abused and assaulted. These are the sorts of things that make it hard to do your job. They make it hard to earn money, and they violate your rights. So you want your rights protected. Well, that includes property rights. So we have to put barriers between people taking your land and having, like, giving them the incentive to make sure they don't take it. And one way is making sure the government must provide just compensation. So these two basic ways the government can take your property. It's outright, you can condemn the property and the title, and through regulations, leaving the owner with the title with the owner. So these are one way, basically, there's two ways of taking your land where the government's concerned. One is they can just condemn the property and take it outright, take the title outright. They just say the property's condemned, it's ours now. The other is by regulating things to death, so that really the title on paper you own the thing, but you have to get everything you do with your property has to be cleared to such a degree with the government that basically don't own it. It's like you're basically renting the property. You have to get a permission slip from the government. So you want to put a new toilet in your garage. You want to add a granny suite to your backyard because your mother-in-law is moving in. You have an extra kid and you want to build a. All these things require to some degree regulatory or bureaucratic clearances. But you can make ownership so inconvenient and so needing a permission from the government that it basically moves it from private to public. um, so just taking the property would obviously be a violation of the taking clause because it would basically be outright theft by the government of your property. Regulatory takings are more indirect, and there are ways of saying that I can tell you what to do with your property by way of regulation without having to give you money. So such takings, when too frequent, undercut the stability and prosperity of a liberal democracy. For one thing, you can't solve tragedies of the commons. How do we deal with, I mean, another thing people don't seem to recognize when it comes to tragedies of the commons and environment. So clean air, clean water, climate change issues. If you have a commons, a big piece of property that anybody can use and no one owns, it's hard to pin responsibility for pollution or overuse of land on any particular individual. It's a collective action problem, meaning it's the collective of people acting together that created the problem. It's those collective actions. It's not any one person. Now, if you have a corporation that owns a big piece of land and they pollute, now because they own it, you can hold them responsible using regulations. So there's a way in which property rights actually make people and groups and institutions and corporations much more accountable, meaning you can use their property rights to explain how exactly why they bear responsibility. It's your property after all. You didn't want people polluting on it, you could have prevented that. You can prevent people from using your land and your resources insofar as you own them justly and fairly under the system. So the fact that there's all this pollution going on or over-consuming of resources on this piece of land is your fault. Whoever owns the property would be the responsible party. Whereas if it's a commons, it's much harder to make people take account and take responsibility and to rectify the situation. So there's many ways in which the due process clause and the Fifth Amendment's taking clause do a really, really nice job of both addressing tragedy of the commons indirectly and by providing property rights directly. which address the tragedy of the commons. So because of property rights in the United States and lots of other places, lots of commons that would be tragically, or lots of things that would, lots of resources in land that would be overused and would turn into tragedies, but the commons don't. So it's the same, basically the same idea with who takes better care of a car. When you have a car, what do you take better care of? The one you own or the one you rent? And if you recognize that owning the car gives you an insight or gives you an incentive to treat the car better than renting it, then you get the idea behind the takings clause and why governments and property rights and governments that back up property rights are important for tragedies of the commons. So you need that legal backing. So for example, if Sarah owns a piece of land, she can prevent it by being overused and has an incentive to do so. In the future, she may want to graze her cattle on that land. So why would you overuse it or overgraze it, right? It doesn't, which is not to say people don't abuse or misuse property they own. They do. It's just that they're less inclined to do so owning it as opposed to, so, property rights. So Sarah can exclude people, but so she can exclude people, she can prevent them from overusing her property and so forth, and thereby prevent tragedies of the commons. Someone, however, is going to have an objection here. Property is finite, they're going to say, and the institution of property rewards those who got the property first and excludes others. So this is a common objection to this response to the tragedy of the commons and why property matters, both for prosperity and for solving problems. It's also known as the problem of initial acquisition. Um, sort of like first come, first serve. You've heard that phrase? Where whoever shows up first is the first one to be served at a restaurant, retail store, at a line, like the dogs waiting to the bathroom in the image on the slide. So it seems to arbitrarily favor those who arrived and keep out others who arrived late. So we might worry that the institution of property, insofar as it solves one problem, the tragedy of the commons, it gives people an incentive to preserve resources, will end up creating a different problem, which is the problem of initial acquisition. It'll arbitrarily favor those who got there first and keep others out. Now, I'm not sure that means we should get rid of property, but this does seem like a problem. However, our author, David Schmitz, does not agree. He thinks this objection is misguided, and in fact, it's exactly the opposite. The first mover, or the first owners, the initial acquirers of land and resources, actually typically have it worse than the people that come after them. Quote, philosophers who write on the subject of original appropriation, or acquisition, same thing, tend to speak as if people who arrive first, and thus do all the appropriating, are much luckier than those who come later. Intuitively seem right. The truth is, first appropriators begin the process of resource creation, while latecomers like ourselves get most of the benefits. Consider the Jamestown colony of 1607. Exactly what was it, we should ask, that made their situation so much better than ours? They never had to worry about being overcharged for car repairs. They never awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of noisy refrigerators or leaky faucets or flushing toilets. End quote. Here, Schmitz is being a little facetious, meaning sarcastic, and making a joke. His point is that if you looked at the quality of life of people in 1607, and then you looked at the quality of people in that same area in 2025, it's very, very likely that you would conclude that the people in 2025 are much, much, much better off than the people in 1607. There were no grocery stores, for one thing. I couldn't go get a coffee at Starbucks. It's pretty awesome that you could flip on your computer and listen to this awesome lecture about the relationship between the law and property rights and prosperity and solving problems in the Constitution. Cool, right? Couldn't do that in 1607. I mean, aside from the fact that the Constitution hadn't been written yet, and yada, 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 but you wouldn't have had access to this information, this presentation, or anything like it. I mean, not to mention the concept of tragedy of the commons hadn't been invented yet. The point is that we're doing a lot better in 2025 than people were in 1607. Not in every single way, not every single day, but there's many ways in which our standard of living is substantially better. Access to antibiotics, refrigeration, insulated living spaces, Wi-Fi, much better healthcare, quality food, having to work much, much, much fewer hours. for an hour of light or a meal or any number of things. And anyway, I mean, just hell, just having refrigerators, a place to keep refrigerated food so our food rots less slowly than people in 1607 who basically lived on salt pork and husks of bread. And all kinds of other ungodly things than you and I were turning our noses up at because we eat way better. So it's not really clear the first appropriators in this case were better off. Now, of course, sometimes the first appropriators or the first acquirers would be better off. That's true. But it's just not clear that that's always the case. In fact, it seems often to be the exact opposite. So, the institution of property isn't the only mechanism for addressing tragedy of the commons. There are things like prices and supply and demands and quotas and reputations. You can use things like in-group punishment for smaller groups, but institution of property combined with prices and supply and demand, and most of all, a constitutional backing of the law are pretty good for large-scale societies. It's really not clear what else we would use. Reputations are great for smaller groups. There's lots of mechanisms that work for smaller, more homogenous, and culturally similar groups. But in places like Germany or the United States or the UK or Japan or lots of really large-scale industrial societies, it's not clear that the institution of property can be beat. So, all the reason for property and the backing of the law for solving tragedies of the commons.